You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This session features Lizzie Marvelly in conversation with Jessie Bray Sharpin. And kia ora, good morning. Oh, actually, it's almost lunch. It's after lunchtime now. Welcome to the very first Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers event for 2018. It's delighted to see so many people here coming along to see two very wonderful women in conversation. And I'm going to hand over to them in a moment. But just before I do, a couple of housekeeping things. If you can remember to please turn off your phones or put them on silent. And in case you've just arrived late and you're not sure, the toilets are just through this door over here on my right. There will be an opportunity for questions towards the end of today's session. And of course, afterwards, the opportunity to buy Lizzie's book and meet her and get her to sign it for you. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the wonderful chair, Jessie Bray Sharpin, who is going to introduce our guest, Lizzie Marvelly. Thank you.
Kia ora everyone, thank you so much for coming and kicking off the festival, and thanks Kerry. I'm really excited about this session because as I was showing Lizzie earlier, I've marked about 1 million pages in her book and so looking forward to sharing this with you all as well. Normally I don't like to read things off a page, but Lizzie is someone whose bio I do have to read because she's done so many wonderful things. So let me introduce you all to Lizzie. She is Lizzie Marvelly, Ngāti Whakaoe descent, and a musician, columnist, producer and activist, originally from Aotearoa. In 2015, she founded villainess.com, an online media project for young women. Later in 2015, she started the internationally successful My Body, My Terms campaign, sparking a conversation about victim blaming, revenge porn, consent and sexual violence. Lizzie is an opinion columnist for the New Zealand Herald and the co-producer of a 12-part web series called The Real Sex Talk, a youth-centric series presenting credible information about sex, sexuality and relationships to young people. In 2016 and 17, Lizzie was named as a finalist in the New Zealand Women of Influence Awards. In 2017, she won the Canon Media Award for Opinion Writing General, the same year that Villainess won the Canon Media Award for Best Blog. In 2017, she was a semi-finalist for the Young New Zealander of the Year Award. Lizzie lives in Auckland, although she'll always be a Rotorua girl at heart. So,
gosh, that made me squirm. It's excruciating. Sorry, everyone.
So one of the first things I wanted to start with asking you about is the conception of your book. So in the book you talked about how your website villainess.com started because one of your friends sort of suggested that it was something you could do, and it was like a light switch sort of went on, and whether or not a similar thing happened with the book, or if it's something you've been wanting to do for quite a while.
The book really came out of nowhere, to be honest. I don't think I'd ever really seriously thought about writing a book. I'd maybe had, the odd crazy dream, and I'd written a few pieces of fiction that will never, ever, ever see the light of day, if I have anything to do with it. But it was just kind of fun for me. My column writing was an every week activity that was where I was driving all of my professional efforts as a writer. But actually, HarperCollins approached me towards the end of 2016, and they asked me to write a book. And I went away and thought, oh my God, someone wants me to write a book. And then, I said yes. And then I sat in front of my computer screen for about 3 weeks, and I just watched my cursor blink at me because I had no idea where to begin. So it's been an amazing journey.
Yeah. And you said at one point in the book early on that the book is for the bossy little girl in all of us, and about, I guess, being told off for being stroppy or bossy when you were young. But I was wondering about how the process of writing the book went when you were thinking of the audience that was going to receive the book, because of course you're writing it for young women or girls and potentially people like you, but you also start to, there are some sentences that you begin with, assuming what a critic will say in response to that. So part of that comes into writing a book, I guess, wondering what your harshest critics are going to say of it. So did that sort of, I guess, halt you in any way during the process?
I think over the last couple of years, being quite an outspoken columnist has brought about a lot of backlash and a lot of criticism, which, I'm very happy to be disagreed with, and I quite like debate, so that's no issue really, but sometimes that criticism can become quite personal. So I think that has affected me in some ways, and probably that was in the back of my mind while I was writing this book, was, what were the internet trolls going to say? But I tried very hard to write it with young women in mind. I wrote it for a really broad audience, and I hope that, people of all different walks of life and age and stage and background and all the rest of it will pick up the book and find something in it that is interesting, speaks to them. But right at the heart of that is really my experience as a young woman in New Zealand and my experience as someone who works with a lot of young women in New Zealand. So when I was writing, I was kind of holding Kiwi girls in my heart.
Yeah, well, that leads me on. I was going to ask you about your own experiences as a young woman. One thing that I found really, really interesting early on in the book is when you talked about how you'd been at Rotorua Girls High School, and then you got a scholarship for King's College in Auckland, and how it made you realise, without really realising it, you were in a very feminist environment at Rotorua Girls, and then you suddenly went to what, even though had become co-ed 25 years earlier, was basically still a private boys' school, essentially, in the way they were running things. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, King's was such a fascinating experience for me. I grew up in Aotearoa, and I went to Glenholme Primary School and Aotearoa Intermediate School and then Aotearoa Girls High. And I had a blast. I was having a great time at Girls High. I had really good friends, and the school was very, at that time, very empowering and was very encouraging to its students for us to speak up and, stand up and have a voice. And then I won a scholarship to go and board at King's College in Auckland, and I may as well have moved to Mars. It was just this incredibly different environment. And I can't remember whether I mentioned this in the book. I might have, but the kind of place where, for example, on my first day at the school, in the dining hall, I walked in and with a whole bunch of new girls, and there were a group of boys, probably the dining hall was nearly full of boys. And I could see them holding up pieces of toast, and I thought, what on earth is going on? And when I finally got closer to them, I realised that they were holding up pieces of toast, that they'd taken some Marmite and they'd drawn a number out of 10 on the piece of toast, and they were holding it up, ranking the girls' attractiveness as we walked past. And this is in 2006. A chant at King's was "Get back in the kitchen." So it was this, what I hadn't realised at that point was that being at Girls High, being at an all-girls school, we were feminists, but we didn't really need to call ourselves feminists because we lived in a feminist environment. And then when I went to King's, I think that was actually when I became a more strident feminist, because I just realised the level of bullshit that we were up against.
Yeah. And you said that there was something you actually went to the principal about, some of the language and...
the prefect book. Yeah. So the prefect handbook at King's was at that time like a 50-page document, and it has a whole lot of quotes about leadership and a whole lot of kind of ideas about discipline and all of these kinds of things. And I could not find a single female pronoun in the whole book. All of the quotes, bar one, were written by men. And so I marched myself up to the assistant principal's office and demanded that it be changed. But it wasn't. It took years for that to change after that.
How did the assistant principal react to that?
I was quite known by that stage for being stroppy. So I think he just kind of took it and thought, oh, there she goes again. Oh, yes, I'll look into it.
Yeah. And you also, at some point, you mentioned the ratio of male to female prefects as well.
Yeah.
which I forget the numbers, but it was quite...
Something like 15 male prefects and 3 girls?
Yeah. So that was a very different world for you,
Definitely.
I guess. Yeah. And then as well as that, you were sort of, I guess, growing up in the music industry at that point as well. So what was that like for you, suddenly going from, like you said, Rotorua girls and that really positive environment, or lots of friends and everything, and then not only going to King's, but that's around the time that you were travelling internationally? Or...
Yeah. It was kind of discombobulating. It was amazing, and I had an incredible fun time. I remember coming here to Nelson when I was about 16, touring around with Sir Howard Morrison, and I've been so blessed and lucky to have all of these amazing experiences as a musician. But I was 16, 17 when my music career was really starting to take off. And I think just for any teenager, being a teenager is kind of quite hard as it is.
Yeah.
So when you're thrust into an adult world, there was a lot of pressure on me very young, which I found quite difficult. I think at the time I didn't really think about it. I just kind of kept going. But looking back, it was a lot.
Yeah, and that's on top of the normal pressures of high school and everything. We were talking earlier about the when you're out of high school, how you realise how kind of ridiculous the amount of pressure that there is on teenagers.
Absolutely.
Academically, really.
Yeah.
And at one point in the book, you also talked about how upsetting it was for you to get 1 B out of your straight A average. And
oh God. Yeah, I did. And I was really determined, and I think a lot of young women feel like there's an enormous amount of pressure on them to do well academically, to be a good friend, to be a good daughter, to, do well at choir or, musical theatre or whatever it is, sport, whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think that we sometimes kind of heap a whole lot of stuff on teenagers before they're ready. And actually we kind of forget that part of being a teenager is supposed to be having fun as well. One thing, for example, is that actually if I could go back and do it again, I probably wouldn't be a prefect, because, that was not worth it. To get up early in the morning and do dining hall duty, they don't put that in the fine print.
When you think about that, and that, like you said, going back and not being a prefect, for example, is it when you think about sort of going back and what you'd kind of tell your younger self now, is a lot of that sort of what inspired you to write the book, or what you wanted to put in the book?
Some of it, yeah. I think I didn't really go out intending to give like a whole lot of advice to young women. I just intended to share some of my experiences, and with the power of hindsight, I suppose, kind of put them into some context. But I hope that, if there is a young girl out there who's feeling alone or stressed or pressured, that maybe some of the things I've written about quite openly and honestly might be helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think personally, my experience reading the book, I found all the stories about your own experiences really, really interesting, because there's a lot of narrative. We have so much access to information now with the internet and everything, and luckily this is the kind of thing that's being talked about now, feminism in 2018 and everything. But hearing it from your perspective and your own experiences put a really, really interesting spin on it. And and one of those things as well is your experience as a young Māori woman. And so I just wondered if there was, I guess, your experience in that sense, if that has added anything to... Well, of course it has, but...
Yeah, I think probably the clearest thing I can say is, yes, I am Māori. Amazing, yeah, he Māori o. Ko Ngāti Whakauwe, te hapu. But it's... Yeah, my experience as a young Māori woman is one who also has white privilege, because, a lot of people are quite shocked when they find out that I am Māori.
Yeah.
But what I've found, probably more as I've become a writer, a columnist, is that when I talk about Māori issues, first of all, they're pigeonholed Māori issues, but there's this kind of, there's this real tension around, I'm one of 2 Māori columnists in the national newspaper media. So, I'm a significantly, tiny minority. But it's really, the worst criticism I ever get is all racially charged. And some of those comments I actually printed in the book, and they can be horrible. It's, if someone disagrees with something that I write about, particularly about Māori issues, then the racism that can result from that is quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think it just shows me that we have a long way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess while we're on the topic of that, online abuse and criticism and everything, racism is just one of the many facets of things you get thrown at you, I guess, regularly. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, but I also, I guess you have to sometimes laugh at the situation. And one of the things I found that was really funny was in your bio, you say that you like date scones.
Oh, yeah.
And one of your intelligent critics online thought that you said you liked dating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he went on to say, lead besotted men on and scream rape.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you just, honestly, sometimes you just look at the screen and go, what? Yeah. But yeah, I think the whole criticism thing...
well, I guess there's a difference between criticism and...
That's what I was going to say, is that it's... I don't mind my work being criticised. I don't think anyone should be above criticism. And I like to engage in debate, like I said before, especially around issues that are really important. But there's a big difference between actually talking about an issue and then saying, oh, you're a slut, or get back in the kitchen, or which are all things that get thrown at me regularly. Or that particularly nasty one, which was about... someone imagined what it would be like to roast me on a spit, which obviously has sexual connotations as well, but I think he actually meant it in a cannibalistic fashion. And you just kind of, it's like, this is not adding anything to the conversation.
No. Yeah, and I think that a lot of people could take some really useful advice from your section in the book about how you have had to come to terms with the fact that there are people out there who are going to say those awful things to you. And even though they're absurd, they obviously take their toll, and you've suggested and written ways that you deal with that and how it helps you. And one of them that I found really, really useful and interesting was how you said that you treat your social media spheres as your lounge, and you wouldn't let someone come into your house and speak to you like that. And that's a good way of, I guess, patrolling that. Yeah,
well, what I had in mind when I was writing about online abuse was trying to give some, I'm not an expert. I unfortunately found myself in the position where I've experienced quite a lot of it. But I wanted to try to present some things that would be helpful, particularly to other young people, other young women. And it's such a, I'm a 29-year-old woman who's been in the public eye for over 10 years now, so I've developed a fairly thick skin, but I know that there are so many younger women and well, boys and girls, and people of any gender who are being bullied online, and it has such an impact, and I just think we don't really address it properly. So what I was trying to do was to offer at least some kind of something that might help, a few steps, a few things that young people can do.
Yeah. And is that something that you kind of saw start to happen when you started Villainess?
It started, it probably had started before Villainess, to be honest. I'd been outspoken on social media for a little, maybe a year or so before Villainess, and that was when I started to receive kind of online abuse.
Yeah. Do you want to, if people don't know what Villainess is,
sure.
Give them a little rundown?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Villainess is a media project for young women, but also for all people. And I started it in 2015. It's a website. There's probably about close to 100 contributors, and they are predominantly young and female, although there are some men who write for it. There are some, trans people, some non-binary people, some older people, some younger people. So it's just this platform for kind of feminist opinion, really. And it's been an amazing vehicle for what I really wanted to do with it was not just to kind of have my own voice be just shouting into the ether all the time, but to try and create something where other young people could have a platform and somewhere where they could express their views. And then through Villainess, we've been able to do things like the My Body, My Terms campaign, which was a series of videos that all touched on issues like sexual violence that went right around the globe. The Real Sex Talk, which is a web series that we made earlier this year. So I'm proud of it. It's been a great vehicle to be able to do things like that.
Yeah. And also linking to the online abuse, the New Zealand Herald had you interviewed recently, this week actually, about the online abuse that you received.
Yeah.
So was that linked with your columns that you write as well? Do you talk about the online abuse in there?
I do, and what I've found actually is that I did this interview for the Herald. I was called quite late the night before, and I thought it would be, like a page 17 thing. And then I got this phone call from my dad the next morning going, "Have you realised you're on the front page?" And I went, "Oh, God." And I went and got my hair cut that day, so I could hopefully not be recognised. And what I've realised, though, when I speak about this issue, sadly, is that it has the effect of just sparking it all and amping it all up. So I spent the whole day, after I'd just spoken about online abuse, being abused online. And they don't realise that they're proving your point. But I do write about it sometimes in columns, and I've written about it obviously extensively in the book, and that part of that chapter was published in the Herald as an extract, which also was a hideous day of online abuse. But I think that actually talking about it is important, but where I'm at with it is that I actually want action now. I don't want to just have to keep talking about this, because we have legislation that is supposed to deal with this issue, the Harmful Digital Communications Act, but it's not. And the legislation doesn't really have any teeth. It's mired with issues, but it needs to be reviewed, but it hasn't been reviewed yet. So really, for me, it's like, we don't need to hear any more stories about online horribleness, because it's everywhere.
Yeah.
We actually need someone to do something about it.
Yeah. Is that something that you can see happening in the near future, or...?
I hope so. I've seen more action around it. Amnesty International have picked it up as an issue that they're working on.
Right.
I've been talking to different people in that area as well, and we're trying to get a review of the legislation. I think that's the first step, but it's one of many reviews that need to be carried out, so it's probably quite low down on the list, sadly.
And I guess with not just your own social media pages, but the fact that your New Zealand Herald column would be online as well, is that where you have trouble as well with people having, I guess, the stuff comment section comes to mind.
Yeah, actually it was a wonderful day when the Herald stopped publishing comments.
It's really great.
No, it's funny. I mean, I love writing for the Herald, and they've been really good to me. But, they're a paper with a certain kind of history and a certain kind of readership, and they have been historically seen to be quite conservative.
Yeah.
And I came as a 26-year-old upstart who had lots of very challenging opinions, who used all kinds of language that they've probably never printed before. Actually, I think I might have been the first writer to ever get the word blowjob published in the New Zealand Herald. So you can imagine the kind of shock that some of these people would have been having as they're reading the paper and they're, spitting their coffee all over it. So I can kind of see why it was quite confronting for them, but I've been writing for a few years now, so I'm kind of hoping that we'll be getting to a stage where that's, there she goes again.
One thing that I'd like to move on to as well is obviously the subtitle of your book, the subheading is Growing Up Feminist in Aotearoa. So that New Zealand perspective, that Aotearoa perspective, a young Māori woman, but also just Pākehā as well, because you said how you experience white privilege yourself, but just I guess feminism from the New Zealand perspective, what does that mean for you?
Gosh, that's a big question. Well, I'll start by explaining why I decided to have that subtitle. And the rationale behind that was that I've done a lot of reading of like Roxane Gay and Lindy West and Clementine Ford and Gloria Steinem and lots of amazing feminist writers around the world, and have been really inspired and taken a lot from their books, and implemented it in my own life and in my own feminism. But I hadn't really seen a book. There's one that jumps to mind, which is Michelle Accort's Things I Forgot to Tell My Daughter, which I think was kind of the closest thing I could think of really to a New Zealand, kind of in the last, say, 10 years, New Zealand feministy text, that had at least kind of received some visibility, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write something that was very anchored in New Zealand, because I think that we probably don't see as much. I look back to the 60s and the 70s when Broadsheet was being printed, and when Sandra Coney and Anne Else were doing lots of writing, and there was, I think Sandra's written about 20-something books, so there's a long history of it, but we haven't had that much recently.
Yeah.
And as a young woman in New Zealand, I actually I thought about myself as a reader, and I wanted to read something about feminism in New Zealand, not necessarily on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
So that was why I anchored the text very firmly in Aotearoa.
Yeah.
But did you ask me what New Zealand feminism means to me? Do you want me to hang myself? You handed me the rope. To me, New Zealand feminism, well, we've got such a proud history of it. Obviously it's 125 years since suffrage this year. But even for me, it goes even beyond that, because I think about my Māori tupuna, and, in Māori communities pre-contact, there were female rangatira, female chiefs, who actually made decisions for the whole tribe. Well, not for the whole tribe, because, Māori processes are more based on consensus, but who certainly were leaders and had a say, and had a voice, and had a forceful voice. So, I think I drew upon the dual herstories, shall we say, of Kiwi women and Kiwi wahine. On one side, we've got pioneer women who, had to be tough, and they had to survive in this very challenging country, where they'd come, they were miles away from home, and had to be incredibly resourceful and resilient. So, that's one side of my whakapapa. And the other side of my whakapapa is Māori women who also have, had to survive through really challenging circumstances. And I just think that kind of my whole view of New Zealand women as a whole is that we're tough old broads, We've got it down our ancestry that we are the ones who've survived.
Yeah, that's a stunning answer. And I think also you've conveyed that really well in the book, because you chose to put profiles of women from New Zealand's history, the Her Story chapter. And Lizzie and I were speaking earlier about how we both think that New Zealand is lacking in its teaching of history for young people as well. And
definitely, because I find, and this kind of ties back to the racism issue, but I find a lot of the backlash that I receive when I'm talking about, kaupapa Māori or any kind of issue of whakaaro Māori, it really stems from ignorance, dare I say it. And I say that with love. I don't say that in a condescending or nasty way, but I know that my own history teaching through our school system, both public and private, was not great. Actually, the public side was much better than the private. And I just think that we grapple in New Zealand sometimes with this sense of what is New Zealand identity? What is Pākehā identity? And I think when we don't have a really firm grounding and understanding of where we came from and how we got here and all of the things along the way, I think that kind of leaves us a bit untethered. And I feel like that, for me, on my 21st birthday, I was given Michael King's History of New Zealand by one of my kaumātua, and kind of told to sit down and read it. He was a school teacher as well, actually principal, so I did. Yes, sir, yes, koro. And it's something that I'm glad that he did, because it made me realise that actually my responsibility as an adult is to fill in the gaps that my education left. And some of my greatest joy has been reading about New Zealand history. There's so many great books about New Zealand history. And so with the history chapter in the book, I just really wanted to try and condense some of that as it relates to women, and to, I think, provide a little bit of illustration of maybe why we fall into some of the pitfalls that we do as a society now.
Yeah. And I guess you are also actioning that in terms of history with the documentary you're involved in that's coming up soon, about Māori women and suffrage.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm currently in the middle of making a documentary with a great team for Māori TV around Māori women and suffrage, because there are so many, and this really revealed to me the gaps in my education, because there are so many stories of amazing Māori women who were very active in the 1890s that I'd never heard. I think Merita Tai Mangakahia might be someone who people are starting to recognise more now. She was the first woman to speak in any New Zealand Parliament. She stood up in the Kotahitanga Parliament and asked for the vote and the right to stand in 1893, actually before the Pākehā suffrage petition was taken to the House of Representatives. But there are so many other women. There's Naniwa Itirangi, there's Ākanihi Tōmoana. There's all of these people that we don't really know about. So it's been really exciting to be working on this doco to hopefully try and bring some of their stories to life.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. Is that... Okay, we can keep going. Cool. I guess also one thing that I was wondering about, here's something that I'm just going to throw out there. A blog that I really like, Tusk, they do emergent culture to do with galleries and museums. They always interview different amazing candidates, but then with these very interesting columns, but then they ask them at the end, what's your go-to karaoke song?
Well, I actually have a sad story to tell you about that, because no one will sing karaoke with me.
Oh, I'll sing karaoke.
All right, well, let's do it.
Yeah.
Where can we go and do karaoke? In Nelson?
We'll discuss this afterwards.
Okay, all right.
Do you have a favourite song?
Do I have a favourite karaoke song? Well, when I was younger, I was a musical theatre kid. So at cast parties, I would do a mean dancing queen.
Oh, amazing. Queen. Great. Oh, that's really good. So, are we moving on to questions now, Kerry? No, okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I was picking up the right signals. Oh, okay, cool. Okay. Sorry guys. So I guess one thing I'm quite interested in as well is the work that you said you'd done with the Real Sex Talk as well. And you mentioned that earlier with Villainess, but I guess because that was a couple of years ago, I'm just interested in what that meant for you and...
yeah, sure.
Yeah, and hearing more about that.
So The Real Sex Talk was a web series that it was actually... It feels like it was about 10 years ago, but it was actually released in March of this year, I think. And it's a 12-episode web series, which basically... I mean, who here remembers sex ed at school? Put a hand up. You remember it? Yeah, okay. Who remembers it being just horrific? Yeah, most people. So this was actually, I will tell you a funny story about one of my sex ed classes when I was at school. But what I really wanted to do with this series was to make sexuality education that was evidence-based. You know, we worked with 3 organisations, with family planning, with rape prevention education, and with Rainbow Youth, to make sure that the information that we were putting across in the series was really sound. And then we got a whole lot of young people who were either actors or comedians, or people who young people looked up to, and we got them to deliver sex ed, and it was the funniest thing I think I've ever done, and it's probably the only time I've ever sat behind a camera and had to ask people, how old were you when you first masturbated? And that's kind of the microcosm of that whole filming experience. But they were amazing. And what I found just so empowering and inspiring about the whole experience was that all of the cast that we had involved, they cared so passionately about it because, they had younger brothers and younger sisters and younger cousins, and they'd all had terrible sex ed experiences themselves. And why we did it was because the curriculum in New Zealand currently doesn't have any kind of set of rules for what is taught and what's not taught in sex ed. So you have an incredible variance across different schools. And the only thing that schools have to do is consult every 2 years with the school community. And no one even knows what that consultation is meant to look like. So you have some schools that do sex ed really, really well, and some schools that do it, well, hardly at all. So we thought by putting it online, making it free, making it available, then we're hopefully helping to get across some, ideas about consent and about, all the things that when you're a teenager, you're too embarrassed to ask about. So we thought if we just put that on YouTube, that's going to be much easier. But I didn't have terrible sex ed. I remember, I'll tell you a story. Sorry, this is going to be crude. It's in the book, actually. When I was in year 9, which is the old third form, I was with my class, and we were learning about female genitalia. So we'd had the diagram on the board, and we were copying it down, and we were labelling what every bit was. And we got to the clitoris, and the class obviously thought this was hilarious because we're 13-year-old girls. And the teacher said, "Now, girls, when you go home tonight and you're in the shower, just have a little feel around down there and see what feels good."
Amazing.
Which I have never, ever forgotten.
That's brilliant. I wonder if that teacher's going to read your book.
Oh,
and
God.
recognise-
Yeah, well, I didn't name her. I just said Mrs. D, but she'll know who she is.
One thing, I guess, with that being put out there and being accessible for male and female, young men and women, leads me on to my next question, which is about I've noticed recently that, and as it should, the sort of the feminism dialogue at the moment has headed towards the way that boys need to be taught differently, and as well, and that needs to be involved. And you mentioned Clementine Ford, and she's got a new book out. Yep. She did Fight Like a Girl, and she's just had one called Boys Will Be Boys released. So it's obviously something that people are taking note of now as well. And I was just wondering about that in terms of New Zealand, because you mentioned the sort of Kiwi bloke ideal, and if that is quite linked to the toxic masculinity thing, like specifically New Zealand men and our culture of blokiness, and I guess what you had in mind when you wrote the book, if that was something that you thought of as well when you were, what I'm getting around to is when we talked about what feminism means for a New Zealand woman, and I guess how New Zealand men fall into that as well.
When I wrote the book, there's a chapter which is called Boys Don't Cry, I think, and it's all about Kiwi masculinity. And I mean, one of the things that I get thrown at me on a regular basis, actually if I had $1 for every time that someone said this, I would be rich, is, oh, you're a man hater. And I've really tried to grapple with that idea in the book. But in Boys Don't Cry, I just took it back to basics. And one of the things that really stood out to me even at primary school is, who here played catch and kiss when they were at primary school? Yeah. And so I remember when I was at school, Bull Rush had been banned before I got to school because it's very violent, very violent. PC gone mad. And so we weren't allowed to play Bull Rush. We weren't allowed to play tackle rugby because people get hurt. But we were allowed to play catch and kiss. So, kids running around and physically hurting each other, not good, but kids running around sexually harassing each other, yeah, cool. So it's all those kinds of weird little things that are in our society that just made me go, something's a bit off here. And I then kind of started thinking about, I'm a massive rugby fan. Obviously I sang the anthem here a few weeks ago. But I think that this real staunch, tough ideal, which has come from our our pioneering past, our warrior past, our love of really full-on sports like rugby, has created this ideal of a Kiwi bloke who's strong, staunch, stiff upper lip, probably a little bit reticent. And to me, that's just another box. And as much as I resist being put into a box, I don't think that it's fair that we should expect men to be in these boxes. Because, I'm lucky enough to know some wonderful men, and they, one of the things that I really love seeing them do is break out of those boxes, is to just be the people that they are, rather than performing gender. And I think that's what we expect of Kiwi men, and I don't think that it's right. I say this really gently because I know that this is an extremely emotional topic, but I do think that there's a bit of a link between that, she'll be right, mate, pull your socks up, boys don't cry, and our male suicide statistics. And I think that as a nation, we actually have to deconstruct what we have, how we've boxed our men in, and our women in. And for people who are outside of that binary, who are trans or non-binary or gender fluid, how do they even begin to deal with that landscape? And that's, I think, it sounds very kind of radical gender theory, but to me it's not. To me it's just, as people, we all have a collection of traits and things that are important to us and values, and actually whether we're male, female or non-binary or whatever, it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is, your beliefs and who you are and your, the things that are important to you. So I just feel like gender, I don't advocate for a gender-free world. I think that also causes problems because gender is part of identity, but it doesn't need to be the focal point of identity.
Yeah, so gender coming up, and we've talked about race as well. I guess one thing that's really interesting with writing about feminism at this point is that intersectional feminism has become I guess what we need,
the thing
really.
du jour. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's needed rather than just a simple black and white feminism. Is that something that you come across when you're writing, like trying to make sure that you put that across as well?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Intersectional feminism, just maybe put up your hands if you know what that term means, because I know so many people don't. So not that many people. So I'll kind of break it down. Basically, it's the idea that we're not just discriminated against on the basis of gender. It's also race, sexuality, all of these other things, socioeconomic status, gender identity, as in cisgender or transgender, etc. So there are so many other things that can also cause systemic or structural oppression. Sorry, that was I felt like I was in a women's studies lecture there for a second.
That was great. That was perfect.
But yeah, basically it's just saying, think about the other stuff, not just gender. And that's how I try to think about issues. But I do also think that we get caught up in this ultra woke culture that becomes really difficult because we're constantly transgressing. If we say something that actually might have been kind of like totally not thought about 4 years ago, but then it's now, a microaggression, that that can really, result in a pile-on, and then it's just like warfare. So I kind of see intersectionality as being essential. It's really important for all of us to try to think outside of our own lenses. But what I would really like with intersectionality is a little bit more gentleness. And I know I'll be, slammed for tone policing with this, but I've totally lost lots of people, haven't I, with all this jargon. Sorry, I live on the internet too much. But, I just feel like we're all learning. And all of these, all of the rapid progress of society, of feminism is amazing, but we're all learning, and I think a little bit of kind of kindness so that we can make mistakes, because that's how you learn.
Yeah, and educating each other as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
In a way that's not like, you said a bad thing, you are out of the feminist movement forever. I totally embrace and try to put my intersectionality into action, but I also hope that we can find some gentleness.
Okay. Fair enough, when we've discussed the kinds of things that happen
Yeah.
online. One thing I've wanted to ask you since I started reading your book, of course, this is the book.
Oh God, yeah.
Is, what it's like when you write about how women are so judged on their appearance and everything, and then now your face is on the cover of all these books, and what that's like for you going into a shop or just but you pointed out that your face has been on lots of album covers. So you're used to it.
Yeah, it's just a really weird thrill to walk into a bookstore and see my book in there, so that's the first thing, is just like, oh my gosh. But yeah, it's something that I think, because I was so young when I got into the music industry, that I've kind of been a product since I was about 17. And that is such a weird paradigm to be in, because, as an artist, like you just mentioned, there were albums and my face was always on the album cover and posters and all that kind of stuff. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think it did really have an impact upon me, because there were lots of comments about my looks when I was young, and and I had a whole lot of body insecurities, and that was really, really challenging. And then to have that magnified and have my kind of face out there was really hard. But I think what I've come to with this is that as much as women shouldn't be reduced to their appearance and to their looks and to their bodies, we also shouldn't be ashamed of our appearance or our looks or our bodies. So the way I've kind of tried to navigate this is to just say, like, this is me. And I don't want any young girl or woman to ever feel like she has to either perform some kind of ideal of beauty or to hide.
Great answer.
Thanks.
To the book cover.
You kind of threw that one at me.
Ooh. So I think we've got time for some questions from the audience, and we have a mic, yes. But just because we don't have time for everyone to ask something, we just ask that you ask a question rather than anecdotes and things like that. But
if you want to tell stories, come and tell me when we're signing.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, Lizzie's going to be signing books just here afterwards as well. So. There's a microphone coming.
Just wait so that everyone else can hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Lizzie, thank you. You talked about men getting depressed and suicidal. You talked about the whole gender and anti-woman type thing. Have you gone with your web platform and talked to, well, I presume you have, the health, the mental health? There's a whole lot of mental health going on now. So with the online bullying,
Yes.
surely there's a strong reason for New Zealand to put money into. what you were talking about with mental health.
Absolutely. On Villainess, we have talked quite a lot about mental health. You know, it's something, I mean, I talk about this in the book as well. I've suffered from depression and anxiety quite badly, and anorexia when I was a teenager. And it is, I mean, it's Mental Health Week this week, and it is a really important conversation to be having. So what we've tried to do with Villainess is to make it very open and accepting for people to share stories, but also we've tried to do things like what to do when your friend has depression, or what to do when your friend has anxiety, or how to deal with anxiety when you've got a test coming up, those kinds of things, because we're dealing with predominantly quite a young demographic, so those kinds of basic things. But when it comes to social media abuse, I think that has, and actually it's not just abuse. I heard a great term yesterday, and it was, well, it's a horrible term, but it's so apt. It's called digital distress. And I think that actually a lot of our youth are in digital distress, because they're constantly seeing on Instagram these kind of like curated perfect lives that they're meant to have. They're meant to have heaps of followers and heaps of likes and all of these things that they're meant to live up to. And then they're also being bullied. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I want the review of the HTCA, that legislation. But I do think that a lot of people just don't actually realise how bad it is. A lot of adults, dare I say it, who haven't kind of grown up in that online environment. So I think it's probably going to take a little bit of time for that reality to seep through, but I really hope it happens quickly, because there's some enormous harm happening with our youth at the moment.
I'm just wondering what the appropriate institutional form for feminism now would be, given that you found it very difficult to find. You couldn't find the New Zealand feminism. So how should it be? You got some laughs about women's studies. That's gone in Nelson, it's gone in Wellington, it's gone at the University of Canterbury, it's hanging on in Waikato. So that's gone. So, the second wave left very few institutions that have survived. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the men like King and so on have established a vast range of institutions, awards, money, public money has poured into them. And they've established a very credible new nationalism. So what form should feminism take now if it's to institutionalise more effectively, more powerfully, with better funding? Mm-hmm. What face should we have so that women such as yourself could find a credible theme?
This is actually something that I was discussing with Sandra Coney the other day. It's fascinating that I've been thinking along these lines, and she has too, around how, correct me if I'm wrong and have misinterpreted your question, but I'm sort of thinking in terms of structures. And one of the things that I have noticed about this fourth wave, and I would kind of call us fourth wave feminists now, is that we, up until very recently, have had pretty much no structure. It's been mainly online based. There's been a whole lot of organic social media organising. There have been organisations that have been around for ages, like the NCW and Māori Women's Welfare League and Zonta and all kinds of other organisations. There's Shakti as well now. But as a whole, we don't really have an organisation that kind of is a broad church that can kind of stand at the top of the mountain and say to New Zealand feminists, come to me. And I don't know what the answer is to that yet. I think, though, that because what I've seen is some of us do have the money, and that those ones who've got the money have started things like Global Women and the Company of Women and Super Diverse Women and the business women's groups. And what I see with that, actually, is just recreating a different kind of patriarchy, but it's a matriarchy. And it's like an old girls' club. And actually, you know, in those kind of organisations, girl power, it doesn't trickle down. So I'm trying to think, you know, what's the kind of middle part where we find an organisation that actually works for for all women. And I don't know whether that's possible. I know that with like New Zealand, the National Council for Women, I have an enormous amount of respect for that organisation. It's been around since the 1890s. But it hasn't done well in embracing younger women, and we don't feel particularly welcomed or listened to, or that the organisation is willing to grow and change with us. So that's a question that I can't answer because I'm still grappling with it myself. But it's a really interesting one, so thank you for posing it. And if there are any thoughts, maybe we should just get more talking amongst ourselves going, because that's how it's going to happen, is actually people getting together and making things happen.
Kia ora, Lizzie.
Kia ora.
That was a breath of fresh air, I must say.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm just sitting here thinking back to when I was about 30, and heaven forbid. And I was thinking at that time, and I look around the room, and there was quite a group of active women that came together and here in Nelson, and we were able to make change and work together collectively to have a voice and to rile the community. But we weren't isolates. And I'm just wondering, I guess, as one of those people who got up people's noses, no doubt.
Go you!
I can remember a referral to being women of the worst possible kind once.
The best possible kind.
But I also am aware that it feels to me like the last 20 years that it's been very quiet, and I'm really inspired that there are young women like you coming forward and speaking up. But I'm also wondering, what are your peer group? How easy is it for you as a young woman to be standing up and making a noise? What are your contemporaries saying and doing?
Well, for a start, I would have to say that it's not easy for me to stand up and have a voice and say things because the backlash is so immense. And one of the fears that I really have is my whole, one of the things that drives me is trying to kick down the door and create platforms for younger women so that I won't be the kind of one of the only voices, so that there will be more of us. But I also worry about them seeing the kind of crap, frankly, that I get for it and thinking, oh, why would I want to do that? So that's a concern that I have. But I would reassure you that there are some amazing young women who are doing incredible things. One person who jumps to mind straight away is from Action Station. There's a young woman there who is currently the director, I think, Laura, and she's phenomenal. She's out there organising campaigns and, petitions and marches and doing really, really interesting stuff, like Action Station commissioned the People's investigation into mental health, the People's investigation into public broadcasting. So there are amazing women like that who are doing those things. There are people like Golriz, Garaman, there's obviously Jacinda, Chloe, there's a bunch of young women who are out there and doing things, but it's like feminism is having a bit of a resurgence, and I think it has been having that for the last probably almost 10 years, I think. But with that resurgence has come with every action comes an equal and opposite reaction, and I think that we're seeing that a lot with, I'll give you a little story, with young men particularly. I went and gave a talk actually at King's when it was last year, so I was an old girl by about 10 years, and I gave this talk about fairy tales, and I basically just kind of said how ridiculous it is that, we have the whole young woman who's then victimised by another, usually older woman, a sea demon, Ursula, or a witch, or, so you've got this kind of scenario, and then she's rescued because she's a damsel in distress, and the first thing they do is get married, because the best way to recover from trauma when you're 14 is to get married. And I just deconstructed the fairy tale, and there were a bunch of boys in the audience who just hated it, and they attacked me for hours online afterwards. And so that's what I'm saying, is that while we've got all this momentum, we've also got a massive uprising on the other side. So it is difficult, and I don't kind of know the answer in how to, inspire more young women to come on board the waka when there is that massive backlash. But all I can kind of do is to try to preach sisterhood, because that's how I've survived the whole thing, is just with the love and support of my sisters, and not just my close personal friends, but I've been really lucky. There is kind of a collective of women in the media like Ali Moore and Paula Penfold and Kirsty Johnson, who we all get the same crap and we all support each other, and I think that power of sisterhood just endures.
I would say that the great depressing shame of New Zealand is our high domestic violence rate, and most of it's perpetrated from men onto women. And that kind of that's part of that Kiwi culture that we don't want to take credit for, because it's a terrible thing, and yet it's very deep and historic, and I mean, it's just hard to get rid of. And I think that's one of those issues that maybe it's not relevant to such young women, but I think it is.
It is.
And I think it's just kind of swept under the carpet a lot, and we don't talk about it enough, I don't think. How do you think from a feminist perspective, it's a no-brainer, it seems to me, that this should be at the top of our discussion. And I think that the young leadership at the top from the Labour Party and the Greens, and even in the National, is helping to kind of at least promote that conversation, but we're not getting very far with it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's one action that stands out to me, which was really disappointing. I think the last government repealed some legislation that was specifically put in place to protect victims of domestic violence, which I think was a great step backwards. But I mean, there's so many parts of that puzzle. I mean, to go right back into the history chapter, I can't remember what the particular legislation was, but actually, beating a woman was, or even raping a woman was seen as a husband's right in colonial New Zealand. And so we come from that background, and I don't think that we've kind of sufficiently grappled with it. But there's a bunch of things that are happening that are all contributing to it. Underfunding of services, the chronically scandalised, as in embroiled in scandal, old SIFs, now Oranga Tamariki. We just, as a nation, we haven't quite got there. And I think that while there's all these structural things that are going on, as in underfunding and, just a kind of poor system for dealing with it, it is also a societal problem, and it is something that, you're right, we do need to talk about more. But what I want to say, and I'll no doubt get branded even a man-hater again for this, but I say it with a great sense of hope for the future of our country for people of all genders, is that what I really would love to see in this next wave of feminism is men standing up and saying, we have this problem, we need to address it, what can we do? Because I think women have been fighting this battle forever. But actually, if we want a gender equal society, then the genders equally need to contribute.
Thank you so much, Lizzie Marvelly and Jessie Bray Sharpin. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Page and Blackmore. Please continue the conversation now. Go and buy a copy of Lizzie's book and go and meet her and have a chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.